Well, the dusk hangs like a veil out on the road tonight, where the R62 meets the sky. And these wheels out on the highway sound like honey, and the ghosts out on the hunt are flashing by. There's a fire burning somewhere in the darkness. There's a storm where you just walked out the door, and the road is still so much longer than the way that it seemed before.
I started this journey 30 years ago. I grew up in apartheid South Africa in a deeply divided country. It was in this context I began taking photographs. I've been privileged to witness, observe and experience the radical changes that have taken place in my country. This part of the journey is to reconnect with a group of extraordinary people, fellow travelers and photographers who made up the core of the photographic movement in the 1980s. It was a collective that helped establish an important archive. I'm intrigued to discover what they're doing now, but more than that, I'm excited at the prospects of uniting again with this remarkable family that had such an impact on my life. My specific purpose, though, is to create a book and exhibition rediscovering the archive, finding out about their present work, and telling a story of this country, then and now.
He can see the faces of his enemy. He can hear the voices of his kin. He can smell the sweet.
My roots are in KwaZulu-Natal, a landscape I have immersed myself in on many levels. It is here I have lived with and documented various communities, including my own. Beyond its beauty and its rolling hills is a smouldering and contested landscape, a battleground of many wars between Zulu and other settlers. The lush sugarcane estates on the trip north mask its surreal story. As we cross the Tugela River, we break with the comfort of city life behind us, its rhythms and refrains. I'm on my way to visit Cedric Nunn, one of the first and most loyal of the family. In his own way, he symbolizes so much of the troubled interior. He is a descendant of the mid-19th century frontiersman, John Dunn, who due to his close ties with the Zulu king Setwayo, became an honorary chief. Cedric's great-great-grandmother was one of Dunn's wives. He's a hybrid of Zulu and colonial, and uncomfortably colored. Cedric has recently returned to his place of birth to reroute with his past and continue an evolving project called Blood Relatives.
He can hear the heartbeat of his history as it thunders like a river through his mind, and the past is full of monuments.
He and his new family have made a fresh start on land that is deeply part of his past. In the shade of a wild fig on the Dunn farm, he reflects on growing up in this part of the world.
As a young teenager, sort of becoming very conscious of the world and your place in it, it was a trauma. You know, I remember, it's just come to me this second, that a conversation with my father. You know, I grew up with a father that was also very conscious and aware of how apartheid had disenfranchised him, and his words to me then were that if you feel so strongly, then you have to do something about it.
There's a fire burning somewhere in the darkness.
Our family of photographers were driven by similar imperatives. We all wanted to do something about it and make a difference in our own ways. This was the glue that held us together and kept us engaged with the world around us. Seeing Cedric again opened a flood of memories and took me back to my own hometown, my past, and reflections on my own roots.
And the past is full of monuments and mystery, and the memories creep up slowly from behind.
Pietermaritzburg is where I grew up. It is a city profoundly influenced by both Boer and British traditions. By the end of the 19th century, these two white tribes were at war, which saw much bloodshed as they fought for the country's riches. The city is also the home of indigenous Zulu clans and a large Indian population who were brought to these shores as indentured laborers. I went to school and university here. I found and broke my heart here, and spent many years playing on its quaint colonial cricket fields. I know its smells and secret paths intimately. During the heart of the apartheid troubles, I returned to revisit my birthplace and to turn the camera on myself, my city, and my people. Today, the landscape reflects changes and rewritten histories. It is here that Gandhi was famously thrown off a train, and where Nelson Mandela was captured before his long incarceration on Robben Island. These are the symbols I commemorate now, but then, as a young man, I left for the lure of the bright lights. Like others in the family, I headed for Joburg.
And the road, it just gets longer and further from our past.
Joburg was always the engine room of the economy, where the captains of industry had their headquarters. Today, those captains have long since left and have been replaced by others. This was where the family first gathered. Godse House, the home of the South African Council of Churches in the time of Archbishop Tutu's leadership. It was a meeting point for many of the human rights and anti-apartheid organizations, the United Democratic Front, COSATU, the Black Sash, and others. It was always abuzz with political activity, and not surprisingly, drew a lot of attention from the security police. It was also the focal point for our photographic collective, Afrapix. In 1986, we were raided and charged with high treason, and our archive confiscated. In 1988, Godse House was blown up. This is all that remains.
This is a picture of my cousin Glenn Margot. He was born in South Africa but spent most of his life in San Francisco in the US. I was very close to him, and he told me he was HIV positive.
Giselle Wilson is one of my oldest friends, whom I persuaded to leave the comfortable world of fashion and the woman's page for the discomfort of social documentary. I hope she forgave me. She continues to work on long-term projects with a major focus on the AIDS pandemic.
Of course, the HIV/AIDS story will never end. There are different ways of telling the story. I haven't chosen to go the doom and gloom route, to show people dying, and I've seen it. I have photographed it, but it's not something I'm doing now. I'm looking at more of the sort of empowered side of the illness.
Across town is the suburb of Yeoville, where Giselle and I first met. This is where my mother was born and grew up, and here was my grandfather's house. I ended up living in a commune just around the corner when I first arrived in Joburg. It was a vibrant community, where Hasidic Jews, Bohemians, vegetarians, lefties, socialists, and artists of all kind rubbed shoulders. It was the meeting point and a shelter for many of us then. Today, Yeovil is still a meeting point, a haven for refugees and new African immigrants, bringing with them their culture and commerce. Here is Pageview, once a so-called non-white community that was rezoned in terms of the Group Areas Act, one of apartheid's more vicious machinations. Today, it's finding its feet again. Back then, I recorded a vulnerable community as it struggled to survive and hold on to its homes, rights, and dignity.
Well, a nation's strength lies in its people, and a nation's heart is hard to hold. And a people's stories are its history, and without a past, we've got no soul. And they say there's no reason to remember where we've been.
Not far from Pageview is where Graham Williams lives.
My goodness, I thought you were never going to answer. How's it? Well, how's it been? Long time.
He was one of the last to connect with the archive, bringing with him an impressive body of work and unending enthusiasm.
Okay, this is the then. Starts off during the sort of violence patch. That's
Graham's insights are scattered throughout the country, from the metropole to the periphery.
So who dictates the landscape and the picture that we will see? If the money buys the whiskey, will the talk be silenced endlessly? Well, a nation's strength lies in its people, and a nation's heart is hard to hold.
Joburg is where much of my memory is stored. A city built on gold mining, barely 100 years old, that still beats both positively and negatively. Its rhythms are fuel for the poet, the writer, the musician, and a rich playground for the photographer.
He can hear the heartbeat of his history as it thunders like a river through his mind. And the past is full of monuments and mystery.
Cape Town is a city of profound beauty and devastating contradiction.
And the road ahead is shining like a ribbon, and the road behind is swallowed up by night.
Many struggles against apartheid and poverty have been waged here. Its social layers perpetually challenge us to find answers to questions about progress and development. But Cape Town is also the seat of power and the major nexus for tourism.
As tonight's the night the devil has come down. There's no mirrors, there's no smoke, and there's no whiskey for the man who just left town. For the man who just left town. For the man who just left town.
It is here where we found David Goldblatt and the other missing members of the family. For us emerging photographers, David was a father figure. The South Africa he grew up in profoundly affected and shaped what became an outstanding career.
Apartheid began to penetrate every aspect of life in South Africa. And so this affected me deeply. I was, at first, I had vague delusions of being politically active. I joined the Torch Commando, for example, which was a very brief flash of flame by a whole lot of mostly ex-servicemen and other people who were opposed to apartheid. And then I began to take photographs with the idea of telling the world about what was happening here. Because the world didn't seem to know and it didn't seem to be very interested. And so for a while I think I really had delusions of being a missionary with a camera.
And they say there's no reason to remember where we've been, but you won't know where you're going to if you don't know where you've been.
George Hallett would never have made it as a missionary, but he's a remarkable storyteller.
In the 60s, mate.
His past was to define his ultimate journey and his continued engagement with the camera.
Growing up in Hout Bay, that's where I grew up, was actually quite incredible as a child, because I didn't get the full impact of it until I was about 7 or 8 years old. I would go and swim in the river every afternoon after school, spend weekends by the sea, you know, and we had forests which were eventually chopped down. And I played a lot by myself as a kid. We had a school which was 3 minutes walk away from the house. We had a corner shop. There was no conflict. As I grew older, I discovered that my grandfather was being treated in a very nasty way by certain people. He was addressed on his first name, and I would say to him, why do you call Mr. Swartz Mr. Swartz, and he calls you Johnny Boy, and you're older than he is? And he would say, I don't send you to school to become smart, okay? This is not children's stuff, this is adult stuff. What he meant, this is politics. And if he wants to keep his job and his position and cool, he had to play nigger. And I didn't like that.
Guy Tillum is of a younger generation. I've known him longer than anyone else. As a young boy in Pietermaritzburg, I tried to teach him the finer points of the game cricket. I've watched him grow since then, first into an outstanding photojournalist, and later as an icon on the world stage of photography.
So who dictates the landscape and the picture that we will see? If the money buys the whiskey, will the talk be silenced endlessly? Well, a nation's strength lies in its people, and a nation's heart is hard to hold. And a people's stories are its history, and without a past, we've got no soul.
I was pleased to play a part in luring Eric Miller from the low-risk, high-paying life of insurance to the high-risk, low-paying one in photography. Eric continues to tell compelling stories of the country and the continent. Seeing Eric's exhibition turns my mind to the task that lies ahead. Photography evolved for all of us. For some, it was a passport to life, to break the divisions of an apartheid culture. For others, it was a vehicle to understand the world around us and to share these insights with our countrymen and anyone out there who was listening. For Cedric, it had a special place.
Photography came as a bit of an epiphany. It was a bit of a... I woke up one morning and realized that this was something that I could do, specifically to engage with the social realities of the time. My awareness of exactly how deep the divisions were in society and how little we knew about each other. And I realized that images could help bridge that gap, or just keep the memory of that situation alive, you know. I think I was aware of how images could be a catalyst, you know, at some point, to make people see the light, essentially.
For all of us, photography became the vehicle to explore and internalize our country and its people in a profound way.
I think I had a natural curiosity, and photography allowed me to exercise that curiosity through using the license, the photography as a passport to enter into various different scenarios and societies. I think I developed an understanding of the various people, diverse people that make up this country.
I would never use a word like schmuck.
George began his career working the streets in District 6.
When I left the village to go to live with my mother in Athlone, and I was mixing with these guys, a friend of mine, Clarence Colson, was taking pictures for Mr. Halim in District 6. Mr. Halim had palm tree studios. So we did the conventional portraits, ID photos, weddings and all that stuff. And when Clarence, before he took his work before he took the work to the clients, he would show them to me, and I would always say, God, couldn't you tilt the camera this way or that way or that? And couldn't you remove the flash because the flash balls? And one day he got fed up and he said, if you know so much about photography, why the fuck don't you take pictures? And it never occurred to me. So I said, but I don't have money to buy a camera. He said, go to Mr. Halim, it's in Hanover Street in District 6, and ask him to work for him. Mr. Halim gave me, I think it was a rangefinder camera, a Japanese rangefinder. It wasn't Nikon or anything fancy like that. And he told me, go and photograph people in the streets, 40 cents at the time, and that's how it started. And I was sitting in a pub in Athlone one day having a beer. And this gangster came to sit opposite me. Now the camera's in front of me. And he asked me if I was a photographer. And I said, well, I'm learning. And he said, "Vat my photo." And he's sitting there with smoke curling in front of his face. And I thought, oh shit, I've only been taught how to take pictures in the sun. And eventually I said, I'm ready. And he's still staring at me. He says, die photo nie uitkom. If this doesn't come out, I'm fucking killing you, man. I took one frame. And I took the film to Mr. Halim, he processes and he makes the prints. And I go Monday afternoon to collect the stuff so I can go and deliver it to my clients. And there's this picture lying one side. And I said, shit, it worked. It came out. So I became a scholarly portraitist. Until one guy came to me and he had acne all over his face, man. And you know what I did with him? I silhouetted him with a strong backlight. So I could just get a little bit of light falling on his eye where there's normally no pimples. He loved it. He said, "Lex is a painting, my bro." And they can't make pieces, see me.
I became very aware at one stage also about the kind of news that was being presented, especially on television, but also in the papers. And there was a voice inside of me saying, this is not true. I can't believe what they're saying. This doesn't make sense. It wasn't logical. You know, some of the police renditions of things that had happened was just not logical to my mind. And so going out with the camera was partly to see for myself. The camera was almost a pretext because I didn't at the time belong to any political organizations. It was a pretext to go and immerse myself in some of these things and see the truth. And I started seeing how an event that happened and unfolded in front of me was being rendered on the 8 o'clock news on television. And it was two completely different events, you know, in that sense.
In the beginning, we were a small group from different parts of the country and abroad in exile. We were working in our own separate ways. We had met mostly through the pages of the cultural magazine Starfrider. This became the basis for the emergence of Afrapix and the collective movement to follow. Afrapix started in 1982. We were given an office in Khotsa House with a phone and a filing cabinet. It soon became a home for strays and waifs, a library and an agency, all wrapped in one.
I think I considered the emergence of Afrapix just at the time that I was entering the world of photography as a hugely fortunate coincidence. To join a body of kindred souls, if you like-minded people who were also charting new territories, uncharted waters. We created it at a time when people began to move towards liberating the country from apartheid rule. And so we were part of a very, very, very interesting and important era. And I think it created a very special sense of camaraderie amongst us. So much so that we do speak of it as the family. We pretty much were family at the time, you know.
And I became very aware through exhibitions and meeting people like you and others who were, you know, documenting poverty. If I remember correctly, you were involved with the Cordoned Heart when I met you. I realised, well, there's lots out there that needs to be documented. And even though I was working for Style magazine, which was an upmarket, very white, affluent magazine aimed at the sort of rich, and I decided to join Afrapix and document the other side.
It was a kind of family. I mean, it was a place where we kind of belonged. We shared the same ideals, more or less. We supported each other. We were uncompetitive with each other. I mean, and that was important. You know?
The apartheid nemesis was our shadow, paradoxical and pervasive. On the one hand, it was abhorrent. On another, it stimulated us in unimaginable ways.
There was no question that the existence of apartheid was a prod in that endeavour. If we had been a democracy from the beginning and living perhaps a completely different kind of life, I'm not sure whether I would have become a photographer, but assuming that I had become one, I suppose my work would have been quite different. I don't know.
I think it challenged us as photographers, it challenged me because certainly there were limitations to what you could do. There were limitations to where you could be, what you could photograph, what could be published. The state of emergency was extremely limiting, but it also forced me and others to work in ways around it, to become a bit like water and find where the easiest path was. You know, an example for me is the picture of Kasatu House, the siege of Kasatu House, where you see all the people silhouetted against the windows as the police raided through the building. Had it not been for the state of emergency, I would not have got the picture in that way. I would have been on the street photographing as in a normal situation.
Many of us were consumed in the cut and thrust of the news moment, caught up in the daily events that were happening around us.
I think that quite fundamental to my photographic growth, if that's the word, was the fact that I worked in my father's men's outfitting shop for about 12 years. And in that time, I had to serve Afrikaner customers. Now, I had hated Afrikaans as a subject at school. I didn't particularly like Afrikaners. They were often the brunt of anti-Semitism for me. They bore the brunt of it. The Ossewa Brandwacht was a very powerful organization during the war, and of course most of the policemen that I knew or that I saw were Afrikaners. But working in my father's shop, I had to serve Afrikaners, and I gradually came to appreciate the language. I began to enjoy it. It has a lovely earthiness and an idiom that I began to associate with this place. And many of the people were really very fine people. You know, we had railway conductors and miners and government officials, magistrates, doctors, farmers. Speaking to them, I began to get a better sense of perhaps a kind of complexity, because at the same time I knew, again from first-hand experience, that many of these people were almost racist in their blood. It was in the genes. They had a deep-seated fear and often a hatred of black people. So these contradictions began to give me a lot of concern, I suppose, because I needed to probe that kind of understanding.
Giselle chose the softer side of life.
I saw a lot of journalists and photographers being arrested, film confiscated. I think when Afrapix was raided by the security police, I think you disappeared off to Zimbabwe, and your flat was raided. I actually got very anxious, and but on the other hand, I wasn't going into townships and doing hard news and township funerals. I was very much in the background doing the other side of the softer side of the stories about domestic workers, working conditions, adult literacy, even the Jews of Johannesburg. I did a little project on that.
I had very few clients when I started off as a professional in 1963. I had no clients. And so I occupied myself by photographing things that I felt I wanted to look at. And having grown up on in a town surrounded by gold mines, and knowing many of the mining people from those mines, I wanted to look at mines more closely, and so I started photographing the dying gold mines, and that led to other things. I think that the various essays that I attempted were responses of the moment to things that particularly interested me. The mining book actually was rather not a very tidy and coherent piece of work. It consisted of three distinctly separate pieces of work, really. There were photographs of the dying mines, then there were photographs of shaft sinking, and there were portraits of people that I'd met on the mines.
George, living in exile, began to photograph this community.
I went to England, and when I arrived there were a lot of ANC exiles. So I felt at home immediately. One of the exiles was a guy called Isaiah Stein, and he introduced me to James Curry at Heinemann's, and they were publishing the African Writers series. So he invited me for lunch. I had never had lunch with a director in my life, but it was great. It was a lot of beer and, cottage pie, I think it was, very British. And James Curry asked me if I'd ever designed book covers. I said, yes, I lied, but I couldn't bring it with because I left South Africa in a hurry. So he said, okay, here's a book, Tongue of the Dumb, see if you can do a cover. I read the book in the afternoon, did the cover the night, by using collage system, and delivered the cover the next day. And I ended up working for them for like 12 years, doing book covers. going to African writers' conferences like you saw in this book, Berlin, Frankfurt. Started hanging out with all kinds of writers and musicians and painters and poets.
I mean, South Africa was top of the pops, right? I mean, every day we made headlines around the world, so there was a huge demand for images all over the place. I mean, and you know, young photographers like myself, there was work, and the work they wanted was from, you know, the front line or whatever it was, you know, which in fact wasn't really a front line in that sense of war, but in the sense of, you know, of civil strife, sure, you know. And there were agencies like Reuters, Associated Press, AFP that sort of gave us, you know, daily work, threw us guarantees and this kind of thing. You know. And it was quite an adventure and a lot of fun, strange to say.
During the period 1983 to 1993, those 10 years, I travelled the country in a Volkswagen camper that I had bought specifically to enable me to photograph structures in South Africa. Because structures, I realised, in this country were an extraordinary expression of our values, going on from what I had spoken about before. And I wanted to explore that and look at these structures as expressions of value. Not as architecture, not as interesting buildings, but as expressions of value. And so for 10 years I travelled in the Volkswagen camper whenever I could. And this gave me a good understanding of what I needed in the way of a vehicle and of what I would like to do. That project eventually came to an end in 1998 after I'd spent 5 years of writing and research, putting it all together, and that became a book and an exhibition.
Cedric returned to his roots in the countryside. Guy, at one time, bought a combi and disappeared into the deep rural area of the Transkei. I became a reluctant war photographer, but chose to spend as much time as I could with Africa's first people, the San and other indigenous cultures. Graham's reaction to the violence that he was exposed to was to photograph his friends and family.
The violence escalated, and soon the number of deaths reached 50 a day in Soweto. And suddenly South African violence was big news, and I was caught up in it. It became a way of life. We'd get up in the morning, sit in the car at 6 o'clock, coffee, cigarette, listen to the news, find out where the trouble had been going on in the night, and then head off into the townships and photograph it. I suppose it was also a very strange way to live, because you in one way you were in the violence, but also trying to live a normal life with wife, 2 dogs, friends. So it was really difficult to marry those two and to find out what's real in one's life. Weekends were a bit like mini psychotic events.
1990 was a major turning point in all our lives, a sense of utter relief and catharsis that came with Mandela's release from prison. This was my version, as an excited crowd swept towards the prison gates. Fortunately, Graham did a lot better. A short while later, George captured another iconic moment.
I had carte blanche to go everywhere where the ANC went, and I was alone with Mandela. So that picture with the women running to, which I call First Encounter, the ululating, you know, it's the first time people actually saw Mandela close up. And that was an incredible experience, because for the first time I saw the whole country, and the joy and the hope that people had. My God, it's finally about to end. You know? this crappy system of apartheid. And that was very inspirational.
1994 was the culmination of the post-apartheid moment, spawning a new energy, new work, and new challenges.
I remember when the inauguration happened in 1994, it was such a huge relief. I remember deciding I'm not going to photograph it, I'm going to sit and watch it on TV, and then I'm going to go have a normal life and had my pager in. That was the end of news for me. Initially, there was a huge relief that all those pressures had gone, and I could re-look at why I was a photographer and what I wanted to photograph. I mean, what I did know was that I didn't want to do news, and I wasn't that interested in photojournalism per se. I really wanted to look at subjects which reflected the way I thought and dealt with the world more. I suppose examples, my second book was called The Inner City, and it was about, outwardly it reflected people and places within the inner city, but it also dealt with a feeling of isolation. My latest work, The Edge of Town, deals with the layers of complexity that life has, that each situation throws up, that it's not simplistically right or wrong, or the black and white that one had in apartheid. It's far more complex than that, and I think it's now coming to terms with those aspects.
Post-apartheid, I just remember being broke, actually. No, I mean, sort of magazine assignments dried up. And, not entirely. I mean, there was a sort of residual interest in what happened in South Africa, but and I'd gotten out of photographing the news, so I was a bit stuck. I didn't rush off to photograph the Rwandan genocide, or I was, in a place that was unfamiliar, and it took a while to decide what to do. I mean, I started traveling in, southern Central Africa, and my sort of imaginary realm was, trying to sort of expand. It was like trying to, see other things in the same way that I wanted to see what was happening in my own place.
For many of us, the new beginnings triggered new expectations. For David, there was simply a continuation of his quest to explore the country and its people.
When apartheid ended, I wasn't suddenly at sea. I didn't need an enemy to be a photographer in this country, because I realized that, and this was an ex-post realization, it came after the event, but it's what I was really concerned with, that during those years, my prime concern was with values. What did we value in South Africa? How did we get to these values, and how did we express those values? And once you start on that line of thinking, then it's a continuation. There's no break. After apartheid, I'm now concerned with how are we expressing our values now? What are our values now? And I'm as disgusted by some of the values that we have now as I was with some of the values that we had under apartheid.
For me, it has been an exciting process to discover, understand, and absorb the dialogue between then and now. Seeing the images, big and bold, as we prepared for the exhibition, reconnected me to so many of these iconic moments that have been etched in our history. As I watched the pages of the book rolling off the press, I was relieved but really happy to know that our efforts over all these years would become part of a national and international conversation between past, present, and all that lies unspoken in between. More than anything, the real high of this process has been to reconnect with this family again. It was to the frontier town of Grahamstown that we and the exhibition were headed. Its architecture speaks to the layered history of conflict and assimilation. Today, Grahamstown is the focal point of an annual national cultural festival, and appropriate to begin the journey there.
I had this idea, and I approached the photographers, and every single one just enthusiastically came on board. Everybody came in with that spirit, and so that was really how this book could be made.
I like to think of photography as kind of the documentary photography as a kind of the sort of nation's family album, you know, and every family has a photo album in which its memories are embedded.
I think that photographs, by their very nature, have, if you like, a built-in aspect of memory. But to what extent this has meaning or significance, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know. I think it changes over time. I would hope to rip people, to give them a little bit of a jerk. But yeah, you can't dictate that, you know. People bring to the photographs what they want.
There's an obvious need to photograph and to record events, but well, just to maybe celebrate them further down the line, and also to warn future generations not to repeat the same mistakes over and over.
The photographs are my own personal kind of memoir of where I've been, the kind of places and that sort of thing. But it goes further than that. I mean, that's a very personal aspect of it for me, but it also goes further than that in standing as a testament. I'm always very conscious of this thing of people who say, oh, we didn't know that was happening during Nazi Germany, oh, we didn't know apartheid was doing this or that. And for me, the pictures are a testament to things that happen, so that people cannot say, oh, we didn't know about that.
Eric continues to work in South Africa and the continent, telling stories. David and Guy have become prominent on the world stage of photography. George is still reflecting on his past work and looking at new vistas. Giselle has focused on the HIV pandemic. Graham is pushing boundaries and barriers. Cedric continues his journey with his roots. For myself, I have been more concerned about matters of the soul in recent times. And after all these years, I'm still working with the family.
Well, I've been into the war zones, and I've seen a country bleed, and I've seen chains in the eyes of children, and souls of men that can't be freed. There's no road without a story, there's no journey that's been in vain. There's no peace without atonement, there's no joy without pain. And they say there's no reason to remember where we've been, but you won't know